When you close your eyes and picture the weaponry featured heavily in America's Wild West, you most likely imagine settlers and their inclination towards guns and artillery. Your mind might harken back to the early days of Smith and Wesson or Samuel Colt, when the widespread manufacturing of firearms spurred the US government and smaller outfits of outlaws and bandits with a bevy of weaponry options. Despite the generational outburst of better guns and developed artillery, however, they weren't the only options available to the folks traversing the western frontier, whether it be hunters, soldiers, or both. Rather, some of the most fascinating and unique weapon choices came from the warrior bands across hundreds of Native American tribes, who utilized a diverse set of weapons for both sourcing their food and defending their homeland. To garner a better understanding of what these types of weapons were and how they were used, we're breaking down the major groups of arms and protection systems of Indigenous Americans. Thus, here are the 5 types of Native American weaponry from the Old West. The first of the weapons are the most referenced arms when conjuring images of Native Americans on the battlefield, coming in the form of range weapons. Range weaponry was broken down even further into 2 subcategories, short range and long range. Bows and arrows are the first protection systems that come to mind. While the complex tools of bows and arrows have been around for an estimated 8,000 years or longer, Indigenous Americans were just one of hundreds of civilizations from around the world to utilize the weapons in day-to-day life. That being said, however, by far and away, the native tribes were the major players in the bow and arrow game across the Old West. Arrows are constructed using a stone shaved down to form a sharp blade, also referred to as the arrow tip. The arrow is then fastened to one end of a skinny wooden shaft, while feathers are fastened to the opposite end to help shape an arrow's flight path and keep it aerodynamic. Bows are built from wood as well, not from bone, as some history accounts have incorrectly stated. The wood is shaped and softened for flexibility and connected with a single taut strand of string. The string is the most vital piece to bows and arrows, usually made from animal intestines, nettle fibers, bone tissue, or horsehair. These materials are dried out, twisted, pulled back out, and then twisted a second time before completing the construction of the bow. Other range weapons include spears and lances, used in both war and big game hunting. Spears and lances are built just like arrows, however, certain tribes foregoed the stone tip and instead simply sharpened the end of the wooden shaft. Lances were more of the same as spears, however, they were usually prioritized for horseback warriors. The shaft of a lance was normally longer than that of a spear, allowing for a fighter to stab their enemies while still perched comfortably atop their bronco. A secondary weapon in conjunction with spears was also heavily utilized by Native Americans, a device commonly known as an outlaw, also called spear throwers. Spear throwers gave warriors leverage when throwing their spears or lances at long range, adding much-needed velocity to their attacks. Spear throwers are constructed from hollowed-out wood, finished with a grooved cup at the tip that can hold the spear in place before launching it forward. The wielder will then extend their throwing arm forward, which provides the leverage needed to give the spear additional velocity. Spear throwers can also be constructed on a smaller scale, with darts and miniature spears utilized by shorter users and training guides. Opposite of range weaponry is close combat weaponry, also called striking weapons. Striking weapons were most often seen during fights between tribes and amongst fellow Indigenous Americans, and could even be thrown if the wielder maintained top-notch accuracy. The most iconic of the striking weapons was the war hatchet. War hatchets resembled the axes the European colonists brought with them via early colonization, and were revolutionized versions of ancient grooved axes seen in the area from nearly 10,000 years ago. War hatchets were normally made of a wooden or stone handle, topped with a similar stone blade sharpened to cut even the toughest of material. Sometimes, the blade was constructed with iron, especially after the heyday of Western migration in America in the 19th century. Similar to war hatchets were pipe tomahawks, a version of a hatchet that also worked as a smoking pipe. tomahawks were the most likely to be used as short-range weapons of all the striking arms, and were also utilized in the skinning of animals for both their meat and their fur. Depending on the tribe, pipe tomahawks were gradually removed from battlefield strategies and became incredibly ceremonial objects amongst the indigenous. Pipe smoking is heavily featured in countless cultures around the American West, and continues to hold much significance in tales of the Old West and the pre-colonial lives of Native Americans. If a warrior wielded a striking weapon that wasn't a hatchet or tomahawk, they most likely carried a club at their side. The most common type of club was the stone club, involving a heavy or dense stone wrapped taut to the end of a wooden handle. The handle had to be sturdy too, otherwise it wouldn't withstand even a single blow. When building a stone club, warriors were instructed to use flint and other types of quartz available to them. In the present day, scholars believe stone clubs were actually predominantly ceremonial, much like the pipe tomahawk, and rarely used on the warpath. The sister club to stone clubs was the wooden club. These were fashioned exactly like their stone counterparts. However, the end was sometimes sharpened to form a sharp blade. These clubs were the weapon of choice by the woodland tribes, frequently made from oak and maple trees. The cousin club to both weapons was the gunstock war club, not used until the 18th and 19th centuries in America. The Central and Northern Plains tribes modeled these arms after the stock of 18th century muskets, brought over west by European settlers. The purpose of creating gunstock war clubs is debated amongst many. Some believe they were actually created as a way to intimidate rival tribes and warrior bands, making it appear as if they actually wielded real guns. Others believe the gunstock war clubs were made out of sheer surprise at the effectiveness of muskets used as striking weapons themselves. The tribes might have felt the stock shape was perfect for close combat, and modeled the clubs for a similar approach. The most often used weapon amongst indigenous tribes of the American West weren't solely seen on the battlefield, but rather equally used between fighting and hunting. This type of arms is categorized as cutting weaponry, usually represented by both long and short-bladed knives. A very select few tribes adapted the sword-wielding tactics of Europeans, who first flocked to the shores of America in the 16th and 17th centuries, but these practices did not spread very far west. Most 19th century to modern-day Native American tribes preferred shorter blades, and these weapons repeatedly came in the form of knives. Knives were a vital tool to indigenous life. They were frequently used in the killing of game and the preparation of food. They helped hunters skin their captured animals and remove meat for either immediate consumption or long-term storage. They were also wielded as weapons to be used in close combat, stealth missions, and as a last line of defense. Knives were also instrumental in various intimidation tactics, such as the collection of scalps amongst certain bands of warrior tribes. However, it should be noted the idea of scalping was not as widespread as it sometimes is reported, and certainly wasn't emblematic of all knife wielders across the frontier. Knives were usually constructed of natural hard materials, such as big game bone or deer antlers. Some tribes built their short blades with refined stone, tightly woven into a wooden handle chiseled from tree trunks. A few decades after the migration of settlers across the United States, some indigenous tribes constructed their knives from iron or steel, inspired by the Europeans before them. Other bands crafted their knives from the iron and copper deposits found in the meteorites that had crashed into the Earth's crust. Switching from the offensive side to the defensive side are a different type of weapon, utilized more to deflect the assault of opponents rather than deal damage of any significant amount. These types of weapons usually came in the form of shields, more specifically referred to as war shields by various tribes. While not all warriors on the battlefield chose to carry shields, as they would sometimes take away agility or stealth, they did provide a hefty amount of protection from slower projectiles and striking weapons used by opposing tribesmen or pioneers. Many of these shields were constructed with a circular base formed by a wooden frame that chiseled until the edges were rounded and smooth. A tougher material, usually leather or cowhide, was then wrapped taut across the frame, accented with paint, feathers, and other distinguishable features. Many tribes called these creations war shields, as they were most often seen carried into battle in various conflicts across both the American West and other North American territories. War shields were designed to not only deflect arrows or lesser projectiles, but also constructed to redirect spears and other hand-to-hand combat options. Warriors on horseback were especially fond of shields, as it didn't hinder their movement or attack styles, as shields might for foot soldiers. The more experienced shield makers amongst tribes of the Great Plains used neck leather from the American buffalo, a much tougher and more prolific material than regular cowhide or cotton, as was used by the more eastward tribes. Of course, these extra tough war shields declined significantly in popularity in the latter half of the 19th century, as the systematic destruction of the American buffalo by the US government targeted not just the indigenous food supply, but their top resource for weapons customization as well. After the loss of buffalo, the Great Plains tribes turned to elk and horsehide, despite their lesser quality. For Pueblo tribes and other bands located in the American Southwest, war shields were often made of wicker, in combination with the aforementioned rawhide and heavy layers of cotton fiber. Amongst the Dakota tribes of the Northern Plains, young men constructing a war shield became a vital event in their growth and maturation as potential warriors. At a young age, they would conduct a ceremony known as shield smoking. Shield smoking consisted of digging a hole 2 feet deep and 2 feet wide, building a fire within its walls, and letting the shield's rawhide stretch horizontally over the fire's flames, using pegs to hold down the edges of the skin. As the rawhide was smoked, the young warrior is joined by his best friend at the fire pit, and the two engage in song and dance. This ceremonial act is to ask the power of the Great Spirit to strike the shield, giving the newfound soldier ultimate protection from his enemies. After the dance, glue is spread across the smoked hide, and the builder waits for it to dry, creating the thick, durable foundation of the war shield. Of all the defensive materials utilized by fighters across the Wild West, this war shield is most likely the best. Dakota shield smoking ceremonies are very much connected to the fifth and final type of weaponry utilized by various Native American tribes, another form of shield called medicine shields. Medicine shields and their similar counterparts are much more symbolic in their usage, carried by warriors not to deflect bolts or blows, but rather harness the spiritual energy necessary to survive the battlefield. Like war shields, medicine shields are carefully constructed in ceremonial settings, utilizing a circular frame, a leather facing, and paint and feathers to display the expression and identity of the individuals that wield them. If a medicine shield has been properly built, its user will engage in conflict with a spiritual protection, guided by gods and spirits of certain tribes' cultures. The main difference between the physical nature of each shield is their weight. War shields are made dense with a combination of thick rawhide and plenty of adhesive substances. Medicine shields are made lighter, with thinner leather stretched across the frame. The lighter nature of medicine shields makes it possible for foot soldiers to carry such weapons, as they do not add much hindrance or dead weight to the warriors known for their fleet of foot. When it comes to the specific symbols seen painted on medicine shields, the exact decoration depends wholly on the wielder's spiritual journey. If the user has a long history of understanding medicine and spiritualism, their strength may be displayed with gods or goddesses representing the ultimate warrior. If the user is newer to medicine or lacks a mature knowledge of their spiritual quest, their shield may be more plain. As the user grows in their wisdom and refines their skills on the battlefield, their medicine shields will become more ornate and filled with spiritual power. Symbolic weapons may be the most misunderstood of all Native American arms, but are the best representation of the indigenous way of life and their connection with the spiritual worlds. Culture at the forefront, rather than the easier path to bloodshed and violence.